Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Trash Talk. This is the show where we talk about whatever the hell I want to talk about. Gosh dang it. My name is DJ Woldridge, and with me today, I have a very, very special guest, Andrew Sage. Andrew, would you introduce yourself to the kids at home?
Hello. Thank you for having me here, DJ. I am Andrew. I am a writer, YouTuber, artist, whatever else from Trinidad and Tobago, born, raised, and still based in Trinidad and Tobago, Twin Island Republic in the southern part of the Caribbean. And I have been doing this stuff for about 5 years now, and I'm really excited to be part of this conversation, to share some of the things that I'm passionate about and, really get the message out.
I really want to thank you for taking the time to stop by this show and talk with me today because for some reason, we're going to be talking about anarchism today. And, just for whatever reason, I was just thinking more about alternate forms of government. No reason in particular. And I came across some of your work initially listening to the It Could Happen Here podcast where you talked about this subject. And I was really excited when you agreed to come on to talk about this with me because I think this is a topic. I know with me growing up, I grew up in a conservative Christian background. The term anarchism had a very specific connotation, and kind of learning what it means in a more what's the word I'm looking for? Like a more political aspect. It's an ideology. Has been an interesting process. But before we get into all that, I don't want to start hot and heavy. Let's start a little light. I like to open the show with asking my guests, what are you into? Are you watching, reading, playing a video game, something that you'd like to share with the class today?
Sure. I mean, I'm definitely a big consumer of media.
Yeah.
Lately, I haven't really been keeping up with the movie scene. I do want to watch Sinners eventually, but I haven't gotten around to it yet. I think the last movie I watched was 12 Angry Men.
It's a great one.
It was fantastic. In terms of TV, I keep up with a lot of the popular shows. Invincible, Severance, White Lotus, and as ashamed as I am to admit it, a lot of my time lately has been occupied by Marvel Rivals. Just getting into that competitive grind, trying to rank up.
So I have a friend whose wife streams Marvel Rivals, and I've never gotten into, as I get older, I settle more into single player. I don't need the kids yelling at me online.
Completely fair.
Yeah. But
that's usually my shtick,
Do you have, but we cover a lot of superhero media on my personal channel and my podcast network, Only Stupid Answers. So obviously I see a lot of that stuff, and it's like, oh, the designs are cool. Like do you have any go-to characters you like to play in Marvel Rivals?
In Rivals right now, my main is Thor.
Okay.
When I first started, I was playing like Iron Fist, and then I got into Moon Knight for a bit, but I don't know, the DPS experience for me is not the most consistent. I don't have the best mechanical skills, so I find that being up close and personal with Thor's hammer bashing away at the enemy team, it's a bit easier to keep track of.
Yeah, I think that's a concern of mine getting into a game like that, because obviously I'm going to want to go to my favorite characters like Moon Knight and Spider-Man and stuff like that. It's like, but what if I'm not good at them? What if I'm not good at those characters?
Spider-Man's one of my favorite media characters in general of all time. But I've never even bothered to pick him up because his skill set, the skill floor for Spider-Man, I think, is pretty high in that game.
I wonder if that's intentional. They're like, everybody's going to want to be Spider-Man, so we got to make it challenging so they try other characters.
That could be part of it. I mean, the amount of combos that you have to learn just to play that character and get value out of him is definitely something. I was always more of a DC fan than a Marvel fan.
Yeah, you and I are in the same boat. Yeah. I'm very excited.
So I'm a bit disappointed that DC has been dropping the ball these past few decades. But hopefully this game and everything else encourages DC to take a swing at the genre.
Well, I'm hoping in general for a resurgence. I'm very hopeful, optimistic, cautiously optimistic. That's the way to phrase it for the new Superman movie, and hopefully that opens
Same.
the door for more opportunities. Because I didn't even bother. I'm one of the reasons that Suicide Squad game didn't do well. I didn't even bother, even though I love the Rocksteady Batman games. I'm like, this doesn't look like what I want.
When I saw the first trailer for that game, I was like, "Oh, this is looking interesting." And
Yeah.
then more and more information came out about this, and I was like,
Yeah.
"I'm
Yeah.
not bothering."
And then they're like, then Rocksteady's like, we're going to make more Batman games. I'm like, you make good Batman games, but we already have, they exist, and it'd be cool to do other things. But yeah, I will probably, just you talking about my Marvel Rivals right now, like when you're talking about the skill floor and stuff like that, I was like, that stressing me out. So I think I'm going to stick with my little, I'll wait until is Insomniac. I'll wait till Insomniac comes out with Spider-Man 3, and I'll be good to go.
That's fair.
All right, so let us know in the comments what's your favorite Marvel Rivals characters. Let's get into this a little bit, kind of circling back to where we started this conversation. So, like I mentioned, I cover a lot of superhero media and comics, movies, all that, and almost always, universally, when things are really hitting the fan and everybody's worried, and they're like, it's anarchy in the streets, or like it's basically anarchy is synonymous with things have gone wrong. So when you talk about on your channel and stuff like that, when you talk about anarchy, what are you describing, and how is it different from that?
Yeah, so it's interesting because in a sense, anarchists and people who are opposed to anarchism agree on one thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is that anarchy is a world without rule, without rulership,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
right? The difference is in perspective. Anarchists see that as a positive,
Yeah.
And those who are opposed to anarchism see it as a negative. It's basically, and the reason they see it as a negative is because, and the reason anarchy is shorthand for bad, is because it's implied that without rulership, society could not function.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's the exact sort of narrative that authorities love and need, because alternatives, despite the fact that they have existed throughout human history, despite the fact that human history is not a limit on our possibilities for the future,
Mm-hmm.
those alternatives cannot be explored or presented or even thought about in a positive manner, because that puts the whole project in jeopardy.
Yeah.
So anarchy would, so even if, and I'm not to say that anarchists in the past didn't do things that may have, lended itself to our current association with chaos or whatever the case may be. But even if all of the anarchists of the past were total saints who never assassinated any world leaders or anything like that,
Yeah.
anarchy would still be shorthand for bad, because it's still the antithesis of this system. A society which rejects the principle of authority and all the other hierarchies that privilege some over others is in such stark contrast to the one we have now that it's inconceivable. But to me, and the anarchy that I'm talking about and that I'm pursuing, is positively a world without rule, where autonomy, mutuality, as in mutual aid, and free association form the basis of our society. It is the basis upon which we interact with each other. It's the basis upon which we take care of each other, not placing any one person or group above another.
You're making me think of, and I feel like I've mentioned this on a couple shows at this point. I just finished reading Tribe by Sebastian Junger, and that talks a little bit about how, and I've heard discussion about this before. When a crisis like an earthquake or armed conflict or something, like they use it as an example, the Blitz during World War II. There's a lot of concern from the people in charge, like everybody's going to lose their mind. It's going to be chaos in the streets, and what tends to happen is that people actually kind of coalesce and work together and bond. And so there seems to be this constant, this fear of everybody turning on each other like wild animals tends to be a top-down fear. Like the people in charge are like, well, if I'm not here, everybody's going to lose their minds.
Yeah. They have a very inflated sense of self-importance. And I think also in apocalyptic media and stuff, you see that all the zombie stuff, it's all like chaos,
Yeah.
Mad Max, that kind of thing. And Mad Max is often referenced as an example of,
Hmm.
or often used as a allusion to anarchy, but it is simply a case where authority is still present, but
Yes.
just it's more decentralized. You just have a bunch of warlords instead of
Yeah.
one big warlord that calls itself the United States.
Yeah.
Um,
You don't have a Mad Max without
but
an Immortan Joe. Yeah.
exactly.
When we're talking about anarchy as a philosophy, what we're talking about here is this idea of life without these hierarchical structures. So for you, what makes something like anarchy something more egalitarian, you could argue the most egalitarian version of society, preferable to a hierarchical one?
That's a great question. I think before I answer that question, I just
Mhm.
thought of something that I want to share in relation to the previous point you were making about people sort of devolving into chaos and that sort of thing
Yeah.
when it comes to disasters, which is actually a quote that I read from Mr. Rogers the other day. I said Mr. Rogers of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood.
Yeah.
He said that when he was growing up, and I'm paraphrasing because I don't remember exactly, when he was growing up, his mother always told him, whenever you see a disaster taking place,
Hmm.
look for the helpers. Whether it's a natural disaster or a man-made disaster, whether it's a terrorist attack, whether it be a war, there are always people there. A famine, there are always people there trying to help.
Yeah.
And that alone I found very inspiring. And he really was, Mr. Rogers really was a treasure.
Yeah. Going back to the zombie media of it all. You're right. Like a lot of it, The Walking Dead or even The Last of Us, which is on air right now, people are kind of like, it's always about how, the harm we do to each other. And it's like, I don't know, gang. I actually think if zombies were a thing, that'd be a pretty good unifier we would probably all get on the same page pretty quick about zombies. And people would use
Absolutely.
people would use the example of, when I talk about disasters, people probably think about like, well, but wait, COVID, especially here in America, didn't do so hot. Coalescing for COVID. It's like, well, the difference between that and something like zombies is something you can shoot. We would all unite over something we can shoot. That's something we seem to be pretty on board with. And in fact, the tricky part with COVID that I think makes it different than, say, an earthquake or conflict or whatever, is that the solution to it, part of it was we needed to separate from each other. And I think that allowed inroads to some of the more toxic parts of our internet culture. Maybe we'll all spend a little bit too much time online. So it's a different, COVID's a little bit of a different situation.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of factors that influenced how COVID was received,
Yeah.
including, ironically, the way that authorities have basically shot their credibility due to how they've just treated people in general. Um, they have used this power, and Spider-Man saying with great power comes great responsibility. They've used
Yeah.
this power to screw people over, to exploit people. It's very obvious to people that our rulers don't have their best interests at heart.
Yeah.
They don't have our best interests at heart. So although I disagree with the leaps that some people took in
Yeah.
response to COVID and dismissing all medical expertise and everything like that, I can see how they got there.
Yeah.
And like I said, that's a very simplistic narrative. There are a lot of other factors at play as well. Also, COVID is not a visible disaster. It's more,
Yeah.
I mean, there are obviously signs of it being infecting people, but it's less visible compared to a zombie going in your
Yeah.
face,
Yeah, it has me a little bit concerned about our abilities. Well, I mean, I guess it's not even concerned. It's how our abilities to respond to climate change. Obviously, the signs of climate change are getting harder to ignore and will continue to get harder to ignore. But it does appear to be harder for at least our culture as it is to respond to threats that are more abstract. And I do find
Indeed.
that concerning. And so I guess in that sense, I guess that leads us back to the question I was asking. What makes, in your view, what makes a non-hierarchical structure preferable to a hierarchical one?
Right. I think it's good to emphasize that although I am an anarchist,
Mm-hmm.
I don't equate anarchism with Goodism.
Okay.
You know, I don't see it as the perfect, most utopian, most excellent, most everything ideology or philosophy or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
It's bound to have its shortcomings and its flaws like every system.
Yeah.
But what makes it preferable to me is the freedom and options that it affords people.
Yeah.
Freedom in the fullest sense, in the sense that no person is being restricted or limited due to the whims, desires, wants of another taking precedence above them.
Yeah.
That nobody's needs or nobody's interests are placed above or privileged above anyone else, that all of that is flattened, and that there is furthermore a recognition that the differences between us, whatever they may be, don't have to produce inequality in the sense of power, in the sense of the freedom to decide for oneself.
Yeah.
I think the fluidity that it affords is really valuable. And I think with the freedom that anarchism affords, I also appreciate the responsibility that it engenders.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, there are people who fall short of that responsibility, including in anarchist spaces. But I really see when if and when an anarchist society is fully realized, and if anarchy is fully realized, it will involve each and every person taking a full account of their responsibility to themselves and to others to prevent the escalation of harm and conflict and to ensure that everybody is cared for, that we are regulating ourselves through the natural consequences that will arise if that freedom is not kept in check by each other.
Yeah, I think
If that
it's
makes sense.
yeah, it's interesting listening to your perspective about anarchy and other perspectives on it. It does sound, in some ways, it sounds like a much more participatory, active version of building society. And I wonder if you ever see any kind of pushback to that, because there's a notion, and I don't know how true it is, boots on the ground true it is, that, I guess part of the appeal of what we say we have here, which is a democracy, representative democracy, is I vote a guy, that guy does that thing, that represents the needs of my cohort, and then I don't have to worry about it. I know in my lifetime, that has not, the me not having to worry about a part has not proven to be true. But theoretically, that would be then the appeal of it, as opposed to when I hear conversations about anarchy, it sounds much more engaged. Is that do you find that to be true? And do you ever get pushback on that notion of the idea of like, wait, I got to be engaged in all this stuff? Like, I don't want to have to think about it.
Yeah, I think, well, and that is perhaps what separates me from some other anarchists or interpretations of anarchism, because I know there's almost like a caricature that, oh, anarchism is just like one really long neighborhood meeting.
Mm,
And I really don't take that sort of approach.
yeah.
I think that the activities that people take, the decisions people make will be determined through free association, which means that people are free to associate and disassociate with others as they so choose, according to their interests, according to shared goals, according to shared actions. And whether those groups last for years or decades, whether they last for a short period of time, they only last to the extent that they're serving the interests of the people involved. So if it is that you are not interested in taking part in a particular project or taking part in a particular action, you don't have to be involved. It is the case that very likely you may be impacted, and if you are impacted, in order to avoid or de-escalate conflict and de-escalate harmful consequences, people who engage in actions in anarchy will have to consult with those who may be affected to ensure that they can find compromises where necessary.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think people will be forced to sit through all these lengthy deliberations about, what size pipe to use,
Yeah.
or what color to paint this wall or anything like that. And I also think that with that freedom and with the enjoyment of a collective surplus, of the abundance that all of us produce, but select few gets a benefit from today, with the freedom that comes from that, with the lessened work hours, I think we will have more time to engage in many pursuits of varying interest levels.
Yeah.
So you might decide, for a year of your life, or even just a week, that you want to try out a particular pursuit, that you want to get involved in a particular thing. And so you would associate with the people who also share that interest. And if it is that that's not serving you anymore, that's not something you're interested in, you can move along and understand and know that other people are still going to be interested in that, and taking care of that. And of course, everyone's needs will continue to be met because everybody has those needs. And so the interest is always there to have those needs met, to put in the labor to ensure that people have housing, that people have food, people have healthcare, that people have water, people have clothing, people have all the things they need to survive and thrive, because we all depend on each other and depend on each other's labor in any system, in any society. But an anarchist society specifically takes that mutual interdependence and uses it as a force for motivating our positive freedom.
Absolutely. And so now that we've there's a lot there that I want to unpack. But before we move forward, I do want to take a second, now that we've kind of like laid a groundwork of what we're thinking of when we talk about anarchy. I did want to ask you what your journey towards anarchism has looked like. Have you always kind of tended in this direction, or how did you become more enmeshed in this type of thinking?
Yeah, so I mean, I grew up in a Christian household. I grew up in a household that was very much connected to the evangelical movement,
Yeah, something you and I
which
have in
is a
common.
global phenomenon
Yeah.
the global phenomenon that has a lot of its ties in the American evangelical movement. And a lot of things about Christianity were things I disagreed with, that didn't make sense to me. And so part of my deconstruction away from Christianity over time, one of the steps or stops along that route of deconstruction was learning about other forms and interpretations of Christianity. Looking into things like Gnosticism, looking into Unitarianism, Unitarian Universalism,
Yeah.
Deism. And I also eventually came across Christian anarchism. I didn't become a Christian anarchist at any point, but that particular Christian anarchist that I did stumble across introduced me to the concept of anarchism and piqued my curiosity of anarchism. And, as I grew and as I evolved and looked into different things, I did flirt with other approaches to socialism. I wasn't particularly committed to anarchism on the outset, but I really didn't see the ends or the aims that I considered the most desirable to be aligned with the ways that other forms of socialism tend to approach things and how they've tended to play out historically.
Yeah.
And so I ended up learning, studying more, and eventually getting fully into the anarchist way of seeing the world.
That's it's interesting because I just had on the show my friend Elliot Morgan, and we had a conversation about that kind of journey of going from a more evangelical background to, and I think this is even if whoever's journey might end up leading them back to the evangelical background, I do think whatever your background is, I do think there's a lot of merit in taking time to think about, like, okay, why do I believe the things that I believe? Why do the people around me believe the things they believe? Like, why having that self-reflection, I think, is a very vital part of the human experience. So going back, I want to touch on, you did a video called How Anarchy Works that I'll link to in this video. I found it incredibly informative. You talked a little bit about that, about authority being confused with force and violence, expertise, influence, respect, and coordination. I wanted to touch on that briefly. I guess for you, why is it important to make this distinction on what you mean when you talk about authority?
Right. I mean, it's the English language.
Yeah.
Right. These words that we use every day, oftentimes they're very loaded. Oftentimes they become entangled with other connotations and meanings. Words tend to have multiple meanings,
Yeah.
and political words and sociological words especially tend to have a lot of different uses. So I find in political conversation in general, it's very important to establish what definition you are building your arguments off of.
Yeah.
And so for me, part of defining my philosophy has to involve being very clear with what I mean when I'm talking about authority.
Yeah.
Because a lot of by identifying specifically what I'm talking about with a clear definition on the outset and differentiating from the other associated terms, it becomes easier to kind of, preempt some of the critiques or criticisms that come, perhaps from a good place, but ultimately from a misunderstanding of, where I'm coming from.
Yeah, absolutely. And so you went through all of them, so I'm not going to make you go through all of them again. Viewers at home, watch How Anarchy Works for a more in-depth version of this. But I did want to kind of focus on expertise, influence, respect, and coordination. And so what I get from you talking about those is this idea that in this system, in an anarchic system, where there isn't a hierarchy, that does not necessarily mean with the absence of, let's say, a ruling class, that does not necessarily mean that you're talking about a society without respect or without people or without a coordinating influence. It's just a collective coordinating influence, not one person's being like, I'm the dude, we're all going to listen to me.
Yeah. I think it's very valuable to recognize that difference, like I said earlier, difference does not have to mean inequality. And by equality, I'm referring to not being subject to authority. I'm referring to each person being at equal status, at equal level in terms of their freedom.
Yeah.
And so while one person may have an aptitude for something that another person does not have, a person may have a certain degree of wisdom that came from experience that another person does not have. They may be an expert or have a skill in a particular field that another person does not have.
Yeah.
That does not mean that those don't necessarily have to be tied up with authority.
Yeah.
And by authority, I'm referring to the recognized right above others in a social relationship to give commands, to make decisions, and to enforce obedience, and to control resources.
Yeah.
When a person has that right above another to do that thing, that is when we have the issue. But simply, sharing information or giving feedback or advising on a particular course of action, influencing the decisions of another, or even coordinating the activity, the tasks for a particular goal or activity. None of those things have to be tied to that right to command, that right over others to command. And so disentangling that is what I really find useful in getting into conversations about anarchism.
Absolutely. So, for example, let's say we're living in an anarchic society and there's somebody that has understanding of irrigation, a study in irrigation, is for some reason a big irrigation nerd. And of course I'm not, that doesn't interest me. There is an acknowledgement of that. Well, the irrigation nerd should probably, we're going to defer to their knowledge and information while not necessarily, we're not crowning them king irrigation. Are we talking about that kind of nuance?
I think to kind of build on that example as well, the irrigation nerd may be part of an association that is engaging in some form of landscaping or engaging in some form of farming. And you may not be part of that association. So at most, your interaction with them on that front, on that irrigation front, may be that if they are consulting with the people who may be affected by the irrigation system, that they're getting feedback on, how they can adjust their approach or whatever the case may be. But you might still be in association with that irrigation in another way. You might be both part of, baking group. You both like to bake cakes. And so you're all baking cakes together. And so even though that person knows a lot more than you in the irrigation field, that isn't necessarily relevant to your interactions with them in the baking field. In fact, you might be there their tutor
Yeah.
in the baking field, teaching them how to frost a cupcake or whatever the case may be.
So there's an acknowledgement of people's skills and abilities and aptitudes. It's just absent of this idea of one person being over another.
Exactly.
As you're talking about these communities and these groups and everything, for me at least, and this might be limitations of my imagination, it's easier to picture that within smaller communities more because obviously the smaller community is, the easier it is to be connected with the different aspects of it. When I try to think of it on larger scales, like the state level or national level, both those are dependent on borders, which that's a different conversation or a similar conversation. But or the global level point is, the larger it gets, the because right now we are in a roughly global community. It's harder for me to imagine what that looks like. Do you have a concept of, or would you be able to share a concept of what anarchism to you looks like at scale, or am I thinking about it in the wrong way?
Part of approaching this question is differentiating anarchism from communes or communalism.
Okay.
It's a sort of a sense that, communes are a practice that some anarchists have engaged with, and communalism is a movement that diverged from anarchism decades ago. But I don't think there's anything about anarchist organization properly understood that precludes existing at any scale.
Mm-hmm.
So anarchist organization is based on free association.
Yeah.
Right? Freedom to associate or disassociate without being subject to authority. So free association is what is empowering people to connect with each other and to form groups based around their shared interests or desired actions to pursue those. And like I said, the groups may last for a long time or they may last for an afternoon. It's really contingent on how much those interests remain shared.
Yeah.
And so fundamentally, anarchist organization is about individuals and relationships between them. And so if an anarchist organization is on the basis of an individual specific shared interest, shared task, shared goal, or point of consensus, whatever you want to call it,
Yeah.
then the same is true whether we're talking about a group of people doing a beach cleanup, or a group of people building a road, or a group of people maintaining a bridge, or a group of people running a power plant, or a group of people part of a particular globe-spanning supply chain.
Yeah.
People are going to be part of many associations that overlap and merge and diverge, grow and shrink, dissipate and form. And all those associations are also going to be connected to each other because plumbers need farmers and farmers need carpenters and carpenters need transportation. So they're all interconnected. They're all sharing information and coordinating their actions accordingly. And because the deciders and the doers are the same people, the social order that comes out of all of this interaction is a product of the desires and interests of the people who compose our society. So it's not imposed by people at the head of a society who decide that everyone will go along with their desires and interests. And so when you're talking about large amounts of people who share a particular goal or share a particular interest, that's where coordination and communication practices come in, depending on the needs and constraints of that particular association. And so I know a lot of people tend to approach anarchism and their first thought is like, oh, this is like super participatory local government, or as if there's like some collective body that has the authority to filter out and decide on individual action, or that communities, quote unquote, are these homogenous entities that you have to pick and choose between. But it's like Kropotkin said, each individual finds the full satisfaction of his needs only by grouping with other individuals who have the same interests but inhabit 100 other communes. In other words, we're not limited to the geographical restraints of a particular area you're living in, because you and your neighbor might have vastly different interests and only agree or only be part of an association on one specific thing. And then you might be part of an association with somebody who's living on the other side of the world, on the other side of town, on the other side of the continent. So it's a bit less legible from the top down because it might all seem like a big tangle and jumble of different groups and relationships. But those are the relationships that have society running even today. It's just that the way we approach those relationships are very different in
Yeah.
anarchy. The example I actually like to use is of the global postal service,
Mm.
right? There isn't like this one governing body responsible for all postal um, interaction within among the world. It's all these different postal bodies in different parts of the world in different countries that have to come to agreements and associate and have some standards they created for themselves to ensure that mail can reach from one part of the world to another easily. So even though there isn't one singular authority dictating things, and even though, you know, even within those groups they do have authority, so it's not exactly like how an anarchist would approach it. It's a good way of starting to think about it. That even along supply chains, there are multiple different groups and individuals who are responsible for particular tasks, who may not see the big picture or may not be dictating the big picture, but end up producing a highly functioning society regardless.
Well, it makes me think about, you know, a lot of times you'll see criticism will be like, "Oh, this is a fake word. This is made up." And it's like, well, we all words are made up. We made it all up. So similarly, you know, I could see people looking at this and being like, "Wait, so we're all just, you know, creating a system where we all just kind of like, you know, come up with these different groups." And it's like, well, that's all societies. That's how we all got together. We said this is how we want to do things, and so there's not really anything keeping us from saying, well, let's do it a different way. let's try a different way of
Exactly.
organizing.
Exactly.
I do. So when we're talking about different cohorts, different groups, people aligning along these different interests, I do wonder if, in your view, would anarchism be able to coexist along with other forms of organizing? For example, there's a joke that really bothers me about when people are like, "Oh," and it's probably a dead meme now, but it's like, "Oh, you criticize capitalism and yet you still participate in it." And it's like, yeah, because I don't have a choice. Where's the opt out button for capitalism? I don't see one. So I wonder, is in your mind, is it kind of a similar all or nothing thing? Either we're all anarchist or none of us are, or do you see a system where it's like this group over here, we're existing in an anarchist community, and another one's like, no, but we like our hierarchies, and so we're gonna stick with the hierarchical thing. Do you see them being able to coexist in different communities?
I think to an extent, and I'll have to explain what I mean.
Yeah.
So anarchists do want to build ways to opt out of capitalism and opt into anarchist ways of life. But the reality is, you know, we can't abolish all these other systems overnight.
Mm-hmm.
We can create alternatives and protect our freedom to experiment with these alternatives. And so in this transitionary phase, there will be periods of coexistence. You know, there will be anarchist society perhaps beginning as a patchwork, a few communities here and there, a few networks here and there that grow in number and strength, and that can provide a sense of refuge and an alternative for the people who are really disillusioned by the dominant system. And I think that can exist to a point. There will be incremental phases, but in practice, I don't think anarchy is going to be selective about the authorities it imposes. It opposes.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it won't be like, oh well, we are opposed to all kings, but you know, this king over there, let him pass.
Mm-hmm.
And I also think, while we do respect the agency of different groups, we also understand that those groups are not unified in their beliefs,
Mm-hmm.
and that also those beliefs can change. So even in a society that is monarchical, or a society that is democratic, or a republic, whatever the case may be, not everybody in that society is going to see that system the same way. And so we can probably make inroads with those people. And then, of course, there's just the general agitation work of educating of the alternative, that there is another way, demonstrating that other way. Because anarchism doesn't just want a little bit of space within the current system. You know, we want to change the terrain entirely. So it is, in one sense, all or nothing, but we also recognize that transition, where we can
Yeah.
coexist with different interpretations of anarchy, different ways of living in an anarchist society, um, different territories. Even within the same territory, will have different ways of doing things.
Yeah.
Like I said, two neighbors may see things very differently in other ways. But in the same way that anarchists wouldn't shrug and say, oh, well, people are free in capitalism, they could choose what business to work for.
Yeah.
They also wouldn't shrug and say, oh, well, people can choose what authority they submit to, because submission to authority, we understand, is not meaningfully a choice, or at least
Yeah.
it's not a choice that exists in a vacuum. And especially when people who want authority, they don't usually want to coexist with people who don't accept their authority.
Yeah.
That's kind of what the whole history thing has been doing. So there'd probably be conflict. And I think where there is not conflict, where there is coexistence with authoritarian societies, it is only to the extent that it is strategically beneficial to the anarchist society, where preparation needs to be put in place because they're not in a position where they can handle that engagement quite yet.
Expounding on the conflict aspect of it, because you said at the top, you're not necessarily suggesting that this is a system inherently without conflict. Obviously less conflict would be great, but I wonder when, I guess what distinguishes this anarchism from something that we would more recognize as, or at least in this country, would describe more as libertarianism, as more of like, I want to be left alone, or I have some strong opinions about age of consent, or you know what I mean? Like, I wonder what distinguishes anarchism from something along those lines. And I think as a follow-up, the mechanism for which anarchism, I guess your argument for anarchism is that it's a system built on the benefit of all. And so if somebody was like coming in like, going back to that, I have a strong opinion about age of consent, and you're like, okay, well, you're not, the rest of us are like, no thank you. we're not gonna let that slide. Is that kind of how I'm going to use the term self-policing because I can't think of a better one right now, but you understand what I'm saying?
Yes. I think although there is an absence of laws, the outcome of that absence of laws is that nothing is prohibited, nothing is forbidden, and people take that to mean, oh, everything is allowed. But quite the contrary, it means that nothing is forbidden and nothing is allowed.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing is prohibited and nothing is permitted either. You take the full responsibility of whatever actions you take, including the responsibility of whatever consequences arise from those actions.
Mm-hmm.
And so because you are aware of the fact that you do not exist in a vacuum, that you can't just do whatever you want because other people might have something to say about it, you are naturally incentivized to engage with others in a way that prevents conflicts from escalating.
Yeah.
And that, recognizes that the harm that one person is committing against another is, in a sense, due to how interdependent we are, a harm committed against you. It's like all for one and one for all, in a sense, because you may not be directly affected by the thing that person is doing, but it may have ripple effects that can affect you down the line, either directly or indirectly, because the person who is being harmed could be somebody who you need to survive, or you appreciate, or you love, or it may just be that you don't want to live in a society where a person could commit harm against another person and nobody's going to step in and do anything about it.
Yeah.
So there's a sense of shared and mutual responsibility to ourselves and each other.
Yeah, this connects to, going back to that book Tribe. This connects to for me, it connects to this idea of how as our society has evolved from a less tribal one, it's also one of the knock-on effects is that there's this, things can be done in behind closed doors, and it allows for an opportunity for, let's say, malfeasance. And the big example that's used in that book, it goes back to the 2008 financial crisis and how nobody was litigated for that because there's not this sense of, we don't have the same sense of tribal community, and we're less inclined to acknowledge the practical harm that those bankers did to our society. And so when you're talking about it connects with me to this idea of a more communal system where we are more engaged and are more it's more inclined to acknowledge our interdependence. So if say, the bankers caused however many millions of people to lose, hundreds of thousands, millions of people lose their homes, or we would be inclined to hold people like that responsible.
Yeah, although of course, if we're talking about an anarchist society, they could never have been in that position to cause that harm in the first place.
Yeah.
A lot of the most destructive forms of harm that occur under the system are enabled directly by the institutions of authority, by the hierarchies that are so pervasive that they're like the air we breathe.
Yeah. Wait, are you trying to say it's bad to have a system where one octogenarian can just be like, "Hey, I'm going to tank the entire financial system because I'm got really focused on tariffs for some reason"? You're saying that's not great? Interesting. What an interesting perspective that is.
It's almost like if we are as bad as some people say the humans are, then people should not be in a position where their quote unquote badness could ripple out and affect so many people beyond themselves to that extent.
Interesting. What an interesting take.
Evil should not be
yeah.
should not be amplified and should not be enabled by the way we structure society.
What are some of, because I'm sure you've been making content like this for years. You've been talking about this for years. What are some of the main arguments against anarchism you get?
I actually made a video that kind of pointed to this recently. My second most recent video, which is kind of ranking the myths of the system.
Mm-hmm.
And I ended up getting into a lot of the ideas that people carry. And some of those ideas are often used to argue against anarchism, but those ideas that people carry that upholds the system as it is, that simply aren't true, that don't have to be accepted, don't have to be maintained.
Yeah.
In terms of the arguments that I hear most commonly, a lot of times it comes down to people lacking imagination.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of times it comes down to people having a very rigid or misanthropic or narrow sense of what human nature is.
Mm-hmm.
And not even recognizing that even with their negative sense of what human nature is, that is actually an argument for anarchism.
Yeah.
Because if human nature is as bad as people say, that is an argument that they should not be in positions of authority. I see a lot of arguments that sort of treat hierarchy as, and some of these are just like basic confusions. So there's an argument that, if you don't have hierarchy, you don't have organization, as if hierarchy was synonymous with organization.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Or you have the idea that, any kind of invasion or encroachment from an authoritarian power would automatically crush anything anarchist, as though there aren't more considerations to the success or failure of a military encounter than simply the internal organization of either party.
Yeah.
I think there's also an argument that people make that comes from a mistaken view of how revolution works, that anarchists have to answer every question about how the system works because we just want to start from scratch and burn everything down.
Mm-hmm.
When in reality, we understand that, social revolution is not an overnight switch. It's not one big massive event. It's a very slow transition punctuated by, major events for sure, but it's a transition that takes place over a course of time. So something we're starting from scratch, that we are taking what exists, we are keeping what works, discarding what isn't, and finding solutions as the problems arise. Because anarchism is not prescriptive beyond the rejection of authority. So there are many different ways that people may find solutions to the same problem. And, once those solutions don't involve the establishment of privilege or right over anybody else, those are definitely options that we can explore. And then another argument that I see often, was really like a subcategory of arguments, is just what we spoke about earlier, the entanglement of authority, the confusion of authority with other things, and using that confusion as an argument against anarchism. Like, oh, but how are you going to deal, like, who's going to, be a doctor, or who's going to fly a plane? Like, you're going to have some random guy, pilot a Boeing 747.
Yeah.
And it's like, no, there's still room for expertise and that kind of thing.
Yeah. So we're in kind of at this moment, at least I guess kind of globally, but obviously I'm American, so I'm more specifically thinking of America right now. We're in a pretty fraught moment. Authoritarianism is kind of popping up, especially here, but all over. And I wonder if, in your mind, this is an opportunity, because I would imagine to a degree it is a lot easier. And I jokingly brought up a couple references earlier, but it's a lot easier to point out the flaws of hierarchy right now. There's some pretty big ones. Or is it kind of a more shaky moment, because obviously there's a lot of pressure being put on silencing dissenting voices. So is this a good opportunity for kind of more egalitarian, let's say left-wing movements to get some ground, or is it a darker moment? I think I have a Discord question here that kind of aligns with it from Jake Hefner. Do you think the U.S. is close to an actual anarchy these days? Do you think anarchy could serve as a response to the present state of the country?
Absolutely. I think every crisis offers opportunities for approaching things differently. Unfortunately, a lot of the ways that crises are responded to right now are in a rightward direction. That people are seeing very significant issues, but due to a lack of proper engagement and integration and popular education of, radical ideas, the direction ends up going in a reactionary. In terms of if we are closer to anarchism than before, I don't really think so. I think a lot of groundwork still needs to be laid. A lot of people still need a bit of help in identifying what the problems are, because it's very easy to recognize there's a problem. We see it all around us. But accurately identifying the causes, the sources, the roots of those issues, and not simply finding a scapegoat or attributing wrongful causes. That's the tricky part. And the anarchists are just one voice among many, and even among anarchists there's a disagreement about how anarchism is interpreted, what direction we go forward in. I consider myself an anarchist without adjectives. I just want to synthesize what works. And I think a lot of work still needs to be done in that regard, because we really need to analyze the situation as it is right now and figure out what steps make the most sense going forward. I have some ideas. Obviously, I don't have a full solution. I have a sense of what I mean by social revolution when I talk about the need for it. But there's only so much that any one individual could figure out. And there's also so much, theory yet to be written. And I know people kind of dismiss theory. They say, oh, well, we need to be practical. We need action here now. But a theoretically informed action, and action that informs theory, and that sort of cycle between the two is what I think is really going to drive us forward. Because engaging in the same dead-end practices and tactics is not going to move us forward. Engaging in the same tired theory that has not been updated to the current situation is not going to move us forward. Both of those things need to be updated and in conversation. And that's when I start to think we will advance towards some sort of solutions.
Yeah. So when it comes to that, when it comes to thinking ahead, imagining a more egalitarian society, what do you said obviously, and I think you're very right. It's not going to be it's not, here's the one solution that works that we all need to follow. But to your mind, what is the pathway towards a more egalitarian society look like? And what are ways that people now in the society we live in can live in a more egalitarian, anarchic communal way. And we brought into this too, as we start to wrap up, what are some resources people can look towards if they're interested in this, if they want to know more?
On the reading and resources front, I have to shout out myself. I have a website that I launched this year, and it includes a reading list of some of the books that I consider really vital and inspiring and educational. So you could go to andrewsage.org, and the reading list is right there. And furthermore, you can look to my YouTube channel, where I have 80 something videos at this point covering a variety of topics, varying qualities as well, considering I've been doing this for some time.
Yep.
So I've been getting slowly better as I go along, but different resources, vastly different topics covered on that channel. I kind of like what DJ is doing with this podcast, just talking about whatever interests me. So that's the main focus of the channel. And in terms of how I envision a sort of pathway away from the society we have now and toward a more egalitarian and anarchist society, I've been drilling this idea and building upon this idea of social revolution. It's an old idea. It was a term that was used by some of the earliest anarchists. But I've really been trying to break it down into as an accessible and easy to understand format as I could. And the sort of formula that I've come up with, borrowing from the work of prefigurative politics by Paul Rickstad and Sophia Goodin, is I came up with the need to oppose and propose. The things we do to oppose the current system and the things we do to propose an alternative. And those two things in conjunction is how we can get to where we need to go. It's an ongoing transformation and not a one-time event. It involves all the aspects of life, society, economy, culture, technology, relationships, everything. It doesn't begin from nothing, but it builds on existing structures, and it uses means that reflect our desired ends. We are not going to, pursue actions that are not in line with the world that we want to seek. Okay. So I like to see it in terms of the acts of opposition, which include confrontation with the powers that be and non-cooperation with the powers that be. And that could be broken down even further. Confrontation involving things like occupations, expropriations. The most visible of these is the classic protest, although I think that the protest these days is limited in its effectiveness. I think it still has certain niche applications, but I think it is overly relied upon considering the stage of crisis we are in now. There's a lot more that could be done that has not been. And in terms of non-cooperation, I'm speaking in terms of strikes of all sorts: workers' strikes, tenant strikes, student strikes, debt strikes, tax strikes, boycotts. And these are very risky actions. Both the confrontation and the acts of confrontation and acts of non-cooperation are risky. And it is where, strength and power in numbers comes. And which is why you also need the flip side of the equation to be effective. Because beyond simply opposing what is, that can be a very directionless and vague and aimless opposition. Or it can be grounded in pushing forth and advancing a better system, protecting the gains achieved by that better system. So, it's one thing to just go on strike and say, we want, higher wages, or we want rent freeze, or we want, some kind of rent limitation. And it's another thing to say that, we have this particular alternative economy that we have established, that we have prefigured. Not we move on to the acts of proposition, things we do to prefigure a better world and to shelve the old. So let's say we've built up an alternative economy, and that economy is coming under threat. We may engage in, or maybe in a precarious position, we may engage in, on the confrontation side of things, occupation of factories or of workplaces. We may engage in the non-cooperation side of things, in strikes, in solidarity with those organizations, with those efforts. And you build up that momentum using our collective economic power to protect the gains we have achieved and to advance them further. And then, of course, all of this, to even get people thinking in this way, you have to propose the idea first. You have to propose the critique first. You have to propose the solution first, or even the inklings or the steps toward a solution. And so I used to just refer to, things we do to oppose, things we do to propose. And on the proposed side of things, I was just talking about prefiguration. But I found that I need to be more specific and say that, when we're talking about social revolution, it really starts with the idea. It starts with the consciousness raising. And so we need to quote unquote market the idea, to get it into people's heads, to get conversations going. And that can take place through conversations like this on YouTube, on social media. It can take place through books, it can take place through movies, through television shows, through the various forms of media people consume. Because as you know very well, the media we consume shapes our vision of possibilities.
Yep.
I like to think about how that sci-fi boom in like the 20th century, in the mid to late 20th century, we had all these different visions of exploring space and humankind settling on other planets and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
To the point now where it's such a pervasive cultural touchstone that nearly everybody has some sense that, that is baked into humanity's future, that at some point we will reach the stars. That's our destiny. But that idea that is our destiny was not an eternal idea. It didn't come out of nowhere. It's not something we've always held. It is something that was shaped consciously by the media, by the pop culture, by the promotion of certain ideas, certain memes, certain fictions that planted that seed that eventually flowered to where you do have this vision, this collectively held vision. And there are people today who critique that vision. I have some issues with it myself in some ways. But the fact that sci-fi, something as simple as fiction, was able to inspire such a powerful and vivid imagination about what humanity could achieve, I think the same needs to be done in terms of our social revolutionary possibilities. And that's also part of why I tend to reference and embrace and try and mold and shape and talk about solar punk as an idea, because I think that one in particular could be that next story that we tell. And I think that the unique position I'm in is to influence how that idea develops in the public imagination. And I really hope to see it develop in ways that empower us, people, so that it's not co-opted and, molded into just yet another, corporate greenwash package.
Yeah, absolutely. Well said. And it takes me to, I wanted to mention a quote that you ended your video, How Anarchy Works, that I found particularly resonant, which is probably why you ended the video with it, that I wanted to bring up here as well. And I believe I got the quote right. If I got it wrong, you can correct me. But the subject is not whether we accomplish anarchism today, tomorrow, or within 10 centuries, but that we walk towards anarchism today, tomorrow, and always. And I thought that was particularly resonant because, there's a lot of people that might be listening to this be like, I don't know. But as you talked about with imagining ahead with sci-fi and this idea of us colonizing other worlds, this aspirational idea of working towards a better, more equal, more fair society that benefits everybody involved, I think is a project that everybody on some level can get behind, and is a project that I think would benefit all of us working towards, whether it's something that we see in our lifetimes or not, because I think the action of working towards being more fair, even if society as a whole does not keep up pace, will have a positive impact on our lives. And we're in a situation now where I think it's, at least for me, I'll speak for myself. It was, when I was younger, it was easier to be more passive about like, things will probably work out and you can kind of just take care of yourself and the people around you and you'll be fine. I think it's to all of our benefit that we become a little bit more active in trying to take care of our community, ourselves, our family, our community, and try and working towards that. So I really liked that quote. I wanted to include it here in hopes that the people at home, it helps contextualize that this is an ongoing in whether it's anarchism or not. The idea of making society more fair is an ongoing project that I think we should all participate in. So before we go, you name dropped your channel and everything, but did you want to any final thoughts and remind the kids where they can find your work?
Sure, I just want to say thank you, DJ, for bringing me on and having this really awesome conversation. Folks can find me on youtube.com/andrewism, and if they feel inclined to support, they can check me out on patreon.com/Saint Drew.
Please check that out. There will be links in the description. Hit us up with your comments on your thoughts and your ideas. And thanks to everybody that joined us. Andrew, thank you for taking the time, spending the time to talk with me about this. This has been something that's been on my mind for a while, and I'm really grateful that you were able to come on and illuminate us. And if you're interested in more stuff, if you're like, hey, talk about movies and stuff, you can check all that stuff out at my podcast network, Only Stupid Answers, where we're talking about The Last of Us and Daredevil and all that fun stuff. And we will see you all next time. Bye, everybody.